Gordon Ramsay traveled to Africa as a volunteer, determined to help in a severe hunger crisis. Throughout his career, he had prepared meals for countless people, opened restaurants around the world, and always advocated that food was not just a luxury, but a necessity for human survival. However, this time, he was stepping into a place completely different from the kitchens he was used to. As soon as he stepped off the plane, the scorching sun burned his skin, and the hot wind swept across the dry earth. He looked around and saw nothing but poverty and despair. People stood in food lines, leaning on one another for support, trying to stay on their feet with the last remnants of their strength. Small children clung tightly to their mothers' tattered clothes, their bellies swollen from hunger, waiting in silence. Ramsay realized he was facing a level of hunger he had never witnessed in any of his restaurants before. The people here weren't waiting in line to choose from a menu. They were waiting in line to survive. A pair of eyes. As he walked through the camp, something caught his attention. A child who was not in line. A boy around 7 years old, dangerously thin, with sunken cheeks and large hollow eyes that watched the other children. He wasn't moving toward the food. He wasn't calling for help. He wasn't reaching out. He was just watching. For Gordon, this was an unusual sight. A hungry child usually did everything they could to reach food. But this child, Amari, wasn't moving at all, because he was too exhausted even to hope. Ramsay crouched down and gently approached the child. "Hello, little one. What's your name?" The boy slowly lifted his head to look at him, but did not answer right away. His eyes were weary, yet there was something lost deep within them. After a long silence, in a barely audible whisper, he responded, "Amari." Gordon extended a small piece of bread toward the boy, but Amari didn't take it. He wasn't looking for food. He was looking for an answer. With a trembling voice, he asked the one question that summarized his entire life. What does real food taste like? For the first time, Gordon Ramsay didn't feel a lump in his throat from being in the kitchen, but from words. A child who had never eaten a real meal. The thought of a child this age never having had a real meal was devastating. His entire career had been filled with debates about the perfect temperature of a steak, the right balance of seasoning, the finest plating techniques. But now, standing before him, was a child who had never even experienced the most basic and fundamental thing in the world: real food. Gordon lowered himself further, wanting to be closer to Amari. "A real meal?" he repeated softly. "Well, what do you think a real meal should be like?" Amari thought for a long time. His eyes didn't light up because he didn't even know what to imagine. "Would it be warm?" he asked quietly. Gordon swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, it would be warm." Amari gave a small nod and fell silent for a while. "Would it taste good?" he asked again. Gordon gently placed his hand on the child's frail shoulder. "Yes, it would taste wonderful. So wonderful that the moment you take a bite, you can't help but smile." But when Amari thought about this, he didn't even attempt to smile, because he no longer had the strength to feel joy. Then, in a whisper, he said something that shattered Ramsay's soul. "Before I die, I want to eat a real meal." The words hit Ramsay like a knife to the heart. His fame, his restaurants, his television shows, all of it suddenly felt meaningless, because this child didn't see food as a simple meal. He saw it as his final wish before death. Ramsay felt a tightness in his chest as he slowly nodded. "No," he said softly. "This will not be your last meal. I will make you a real meal, the best meal of your life." But deep inside, he was terrified, because maybe he was already too late. Gordon Ramsay stepped into the camp kitchen. For a man who had spent his life cooking in the world's most luxurious restaurants, with the finest ingredients at his fingertips, this place was a stark contrast. There were no premium ingredients, no state-of-the-art equipment, only the bare essentials. But to Ramsay, none of that mattered, because this meal wasn't about the ingredients. It was about who he was making it for. Gathering the best supplies available, he carefully crafted a special dish for Amari. He used everything he could find, making the most flavorful meal possible. For once, food wouldn't just be about survival, it would be about joy, even if only for a fleeting moment. excitement. As he cooked, his eyes welled up with tears. He knew that this might be Amari's first and possibly last real meal, so he focused on every single detail, making sure it was perfect. This wasn't just a meal, it was meant to be a memory, a gift, a moment of dignity for a child who had known nothing but hunger. Finally, the plate was ready. Ramsay held it carefully, his heart pounding with excitement as he rushed to find Amari. But when he did, he froze in horror. The child sat on the ground, slumped over, his breathing faint, his tiny frame barely moved. And at that moment, Ramsay realized he might have been too late. Without hesitation, Ramsay scooped Amari into his arms and sprinted toward the medical tent. The food no longer mattered. Amari's eyes fluttered closed, his body limp, his breath shallow. For the first time in his life, Ramsay wasn't fighting for someone to eat. He was fighting for someone to live. The doctors took him into the emergency tent while Ramsay stood outside, his hands shaking. He had never felt this helpless before. He had always believed that food could heal, that the right meal could bring comfort. But now he understood something terrifying. Sometimes, even the best meal wasn't enough. A doctor finally came out and approached him with a grave expression. His condition is critical. He's not just malnourished, he's at the final stage of starvation. The words hit Ramsay like a hammer to the chest. I could have come earlier, he thought, guilt crushing him. But it was worse than that. He can't eat, the doctor continued. His body is too weak to process food anymore. The meal Ramsay had just made, the one he had poured his heart into, would never be eaten. Inside the medical tent, Amari lay motionless, his small chest rising and falling weakly. Ramsay knelt beside him, gently taking his frail hand in his own. Amari's eyelids barely lifted, his gaze hazy, but still full of something unexpected, hope. With the last bit of strength he had left, he smiled. Then, in a whisper barely audible, he said, "It smells good." And then his eyes slowly closed. At that moment, Gordon Ramsay realized that for the first time in his life, the applause, the awards, the fame, all of it meant nothing, because he had been too late. He had failed. Silently, he wiped his tears away. Beside him, the plate of food he had made for Amari still sat there, warm, untouched, waiting. But Amari would never taste it. This was not just a loss. This was a tragedy, a failure of humanity itself. When Gordon Ramsay returned to London, he was no longer the same man. He had built some of the finest restaurants in the world, but he had never truly understood the meaning of food, not until he came face to face with real hunger. One day, during a televised interview, he looked straight into the camera and spoke words that shook the world. "I have fed countless people in my life, but I was too late to save one. I will never let that happen again." From that day forward, he was no longer just a chef. He became a warrior in the fight against hunger. In every restaurant he owned, one name was engraved on the walls: Amari, because on that day, Gordon Ramsay learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. Sometimes, a meal is not just a meal. Sometimes, it is a person's last hope.